Okay, this video is going to be about how to reassemble a Ruger Mark II that has been almost completely disassembled. You might remember from the first video that we disassembled this entire gun, just short of removing the sear and the magazine catch. And we also didn't remove any of the sights, and we did not attempt to disassemble the mainspring housing, which contains the mainspring right in this part right here. Everything else, every other moving part has been disassembled. And to reassemble it, we're going to basically do the opposite of what we did to take it apart. So the first thing we're going to start off with is we're going to put this trigger assembly back together. And so the what we're going to do, what I like to do first, just because this is one of those steps where if you had 3 or 4 hands, that might be better, but you know, everybody only has 2 hands tops, so that's pretty much what you got. So what I like to do is to start by putting the trigger pivot pin. Now, just as a reminder, the trigger pivot pin has this groove in it that allows this spring in here to lock it in so it doesn't slide out. Don't get it mixed up with the hammer pivot pin, which does not have any groove in it. So I like to insert this pin until it just clears that spring on the inside, just to kind of get it in there. And what I like to do after that is to take my trigger and the trigger bar here, slide the trigger bar pin into the trigger, and hold them as a unit and just kind of lower it right in here until you can push the pin in a little bit, work it in. See if we can push the pin in, and you don't want to push the pin all the way in. You want to kind of look at it until you start to see the pins start to come out of the other side of the trigger, right, just like that. Okay, so you want to stop right there so you don't have the pin all the way in, because we still have the bolt stop assembly to put in, or the parts that make that up. Okay, we're going to take the spring that bears down against the bolt stop, and as a reminder, these are 2 of the pieces that are very easy to confuse with other pieces. In my right hand is the bolt stop spring and the pin that goes along with it. In my left hand, right here above it, or to the left of it, how about that, is the very similar parts that go to the extractor. So if you notice, the extractor spring is a little longer, and the pin that goes with that extractor is a little shorter, or at least the main part of it is. And there's also a part that extends down a little bit further too, the skinny part that goes into the spring. So make sure you don't get these 2 pairs of pieces mixed up. So what we're going to do is we take our bolt stop spring and we want to insert it to the left of the trigger as you're looking from back to front. What you want to do, you want to put it in so that the notch on that, oh, you got to be careful, don't push too much force on it because you don't want the thing to release and then fly out. So you just like that. Okay, we got the notch facing outward, just like this, and that notch on that pin, spring-loaded pin, bears down against this little hump right here. It's right above the pivot point. So what you want to do is drop that in there like this. I like to just move it in like this. Okay, then you move it forward. Once you see that hump engaging that sprung pin, see if we could. Now, we shift to the side, and you can see I inserted my pin a little too far. I got to pull this out just a bit. Now we can see that piece, and I'm going to push it forward a little bit. The spring is pushing against me. You know, you just want to push it forward a little bit, move it around just a little bit until and push the trigger pivot pin from the back. Once you feel it go through, you know, you're making progress, and then you can just wiggle it into place here. And now once you get all the way in, you'll hear that spring click in, and your trigger pivot pin is all the way bottomed out. You know, it's not going any further. And just make sure you feel for your freedom of movement on that trigger. Feels nice and smooth. And you have your bolt stop, nice and smooth. You see it bearing against that spring. Everything looks good. So next thing we're going to do is put our hammer, the hammer assembly together over here. The hammer, the safety, bolt stop lever. Before we do that though, we want to put our trigger spring and that plunger together. That's what these two pieces are. So let's start with the spring. Drops right into the body of that trigger, just like that. And we put this piece right in there, right on top of it. Right, just like that. We lower the trigger bar, and that little notch on the trigger bar will bear down on that spring. With the finger, I don't like to use metal tools to touch that sear. I just don't want to risk scratching it. You know, it's sort of a precision machine piece, and so I'd rather not risk scratching it or damaging it. So flip it up with your finger, pull down the trigger bar, kind of hook it on there temporarily. I mean, it's not going to stay on there too much longer, but just holds everything together. And you can just, you know, just test it out, make sure everything's moving nicely, make sure there's no grip between the trigger bar and the frame, and just, you know, make sure it feels nice and smooth after you oiled it. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to put together the all the parts that ride on that hammer pivot pin that goes right in through here. We have the hammer itself, the flange that the hammer sits in, and bushing that the hammer sits in, and the safety lever, and we have the lever that actuates the bolt stop. So what I like to do is to start out by assembling the detent spring and plunger for the safety lever. So slide the spring, very small parts over here. Got to keep that in mind. And we got our detent spring right there. Put it all together. You can just, you know, give it a little, you know, if you're going to play around with it to make sure the spring's in there properly and it moves. If you're going to put some pressure on it, make sure it's the whole pad. Oops, yeah, very careful. You want to make sure you don't do that with your fingertip, because you put any pressure on that and you accidentally, it slips off, forget about it, the spring will just, the detent plunger will go flying. So you want to hold this up, so make sure nothing gets dumped out. Take your frame, put it in here. I guess I call it vertically, but it's not technically not vertically. It's about 90 degrees off from the frame and the top edge of the frame. You rotate it forward. Let that cam action kind of push that detent spring in there. You can feel pressure starting to build up. You want to rotate it so this hole here will line up with the hammer pin hole there. But you'll notice as you get close, it stops. It's because it stops on that sear that's right there. So what you want to do, hold the frame upright, and you want to pull that sear forward with your finger, at the same time making sure that you don't let that trigger bar fly up, because it's under spring tension from that trigger spring. You want to move that sear forward, and as you do, you can rotate that safety lever forward, and you can start to see the holes lining up. All the while making sure that, you know, hold that trigger bar down, and making sure that the safety lever is staying up against the inside of that frame, because it's going to want to tend to push in, and then that'll release the detent ball and spring, plunger and spring. So you've got this now. You can let up the pressure on that trigger bar. It'll move up a little bit because it's not hanging on the sear anymore, so it's going to want to come up. That's fine as long as you keep the frame upright. If you turn it upside down, the trigger bar is going to want to fly up, and it's going to let that trigger spring and plunger fall out. So you don't want that to happen. So what you want to do, you can make it a little bit more horizontal, but not so much that, again, this is going to fly. The trigger bar is going to fly out. You want to insert your bolt lock lever there. Take your pin, and again, this is the pin without the bar, the trigger, without the groove. The trigger pin was the one with the groove. This is the smooth one. We start to put it in here. We want to get it in. We want to be very careful. Get it in through the frame is easy enough, but you want to wiggle the safety around a little bit so you can get it through just like that. And you want, again, you want to keep your finger in there when you're doing this, so that the safety doesn't push in and detent goes flying after it gets released. So you want to make the pin flush with the inside of that safety lever. Okay, so now if it all stays in place, you should be able to kind of let it go, as long as you're still, the top of the frame's facing up. So this is, you know, trigger bar is not going to flip up on you. What you want to do now is you want to take your hammer and the bushing, which are together like this. If you're looking at the back of the hammer, the bushing is going to be on the right side of it. The little part of the bushing, that flange right there, that rests in the trigger bar, just like this, the end, that hole in the trigger bar, and you slide it in. And to get it lined up with the pin, you'll just need to give a little bit forward pressure on that sear, just to kind of get it positioned just right, and just give it a little pressure on the edge of the pin, and it'll slide back in. And you wiggle the hammer around a little bit until it goes right up flush with the other side of that frame. And at this point, it works. So you can make sure, you look down, you want to make sure the sear is in front of the hammer. It's very easy to get this whole thing together, and the sear is flopped backwards, and the hammer is not going to be locked back. So you push the hammer back and just kind of give it a little bit of forward pressure, and you can see it locking on that sear, and that's good. And if you pull the hammer back, you can see that sear pulling forward. The hammer freely moves, so you know everything's working real nice. And you can even work the safety at that point. So let's get the side of the left grip on that, so just to make sure that this pin doesn't come out. Okay, at this point, our frame is totally together. And so we can set this aside. And right now we're going to move our focus to the bolt assembly. So right now we have a bare bolt. There's no removable parts left on this from our disassembly. We disassembled it by taking the recoil spring off first, then the firing pin, then the extractor assembly. We have to do it in that order to take it apart. And to put it back together, we have to do it in the reverse order. So we want to start with the extractor assembly. The reason why is because, remember, the pin which goes into this hole that holds the firing pin in. This piece over here, which bears against the extractor and makes the extractor want to kind of hook onto the edge of the base of the cartridge, head of the cartridge. When we have to push that pretty far in, and if you notice, it goes right into that little back part of this pin. If the firing pin retainer pin is in there, it won't allow this pin to go as far as we need it to go in order to get that extractor, the base of the extractor, into that hole. So we do need to put the extractor in before the firing pin assembly. So we put the spring, and this notch over here in the front of this pin has to face in. So we want to kind of try to keep that. You can kind of look in through the edge, so it's facing in the right direction. So once that's in like this, here's the extractor. we want to slide this into this groove until it gets to that hole right where my fingernail is right there. And this end, that almost like this hook on the back of this extractor piece, is going to hook right into that hole, and it'll drop right in. It'll be pretty obvious. So we go put this in here like this, and we're going to slowly push back and pushing in at the base of the extractor, and we should hear it click in, just like that. And you can take a look at it and you make sure the notch, you don't see any evidence of the notch because the notch should be facing into the bolt. So we shouldn't be able to see any of the notch, and we don't. Look at the extractor, make sure it's working okay. Looks like it's okay to me. Okay, the firing pin's next. We take this piece. Remember this hooked metal part? Remember, if the spring for the firing pin becomes detached from this curved metal part, the tapered end of that spring stays bare, and it bears against the firing pin. So if this comes apart, you can see that tapered end stays free. The metal part plugs into the end that's not tapered. Okay, push the curved edge of that metal part goes down because it hooks into a groove on the front of the firing pin right here. And we take the firing pin and we want to slide that firing pin spring all the way up till the front of that metal piece engages that groove in the front. Notice I did it with the back of the firing pin. It might be a little too anal about this, but I don't like to mess around with anything on the front of that firing pin. I like to keep it nice and in good condition. So anyway, want to slide the firing pin in. This notch right here is going to bear on that spring right about like there. So we want to back it off. So we don't want it to engage right away. We want to make sure that we allow it to engage on its own. So we put it back, and then we just slowly slide it forward until we feel it get a little springy. Feel it start to resist right there. Don't want to push it too much because right now there's nothing holding it in. We don't want it to fly out anywhere. So we hold that right there. And by the way, the video makes it look like I'm holding this thing vertically. It's actually level. I wouldn't be holding this with loose parts vertical, so it just wouldn't stay together. So we want to push this pin in. It's a very loose fit pin. It basically stays under friction from this firing pin very, very slightly. It doesn't go in right away. You have to kind of push slightly ahead on the firing pin until you just feel that pin go in. Very, very loose fit. Now you can play around with the firing pin all you want, and you can see how it travels, make sure it's freely moving and everything. As an aside, just one little quick aside, if you're ever wondering why, even though most rim fires, they say you should never dry fire it because the firing pin would put a dent or a notch on the side of the chamber, the edge of the chamber. And Ruger says that you can dry fire these. So the reason for that is because this pin, which prevents over travel from the firing pin, if you'll notice the face of the bolt, which rests up against the very front of the back of the chamber there, hopefully I'm using the right terminology, the firing pin doesn't go quite that far. I'm pushing the firing pin as far as it goes. There's a little bit of a gap there. You notice that? A little bit of a gap. So this pin over here prevents the firing pin from ever going too far forward and smashing into the back of the chamber, the edge of the chamber there, and causing damage, which is nice. It's a nice characteristic of the gun and the design. So anyway, so we got the recoil spring. It's a kind of pretty simple thing. The front of it goes into that notch. Back of it, just push it right into place right there. Really nothing fancy about it. Just keep in mind, you got to keep that pretty much centered, or else the bolt won't go in all the way when we get to that point. So anyway, at this point we have the bolt assembly with our extractor, firing pin, and recoil spring. Excuse me. Next thing is we want to put the barrel and barrel and receiver assembly onto our frame. This notch over here has to engage that notch, I guess. I don't know what you call it, but right over there. So we want to lay it on like this. I'm not sure if this is typical of all Mark IIs. On mine, there's a little bit of rotational play. I've had situations where it was rotated and, you know, I start using the gun at the range and it's on an angle like this. So I tend to have to kind of rotate it, rotate the barrel receiver assembly counterclockwise as you're looking from the back of it. So that's what I have to do. You might want to just pay attention to your gun, making sure that the sight, when his sight is pretty much parallel with the line of the grip, and make sure everything is, you know, in line. So let me just push this together. We push the barrel backwards, the frame forwards, and it should click into place. Like that. Okay. Let me check the, it looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. I think we got it good. Okay. I'm not sure if it'll all click into place like that. Mine has a good amount of pressure where it clicks in, and it tends to hold itself there, so that's good. It makes it easier for me. Next thing is we're going to slide that bolt in, and want to make sure that that hammer is back. Mine just happens to be back. If yours is not, say if yours is forward, like this, if you look in the back, you see that hammer forward, the bolt's not going to be able to slide in there, naturally. You want to point the gun upwards, pull the trigger, let that hammer fall backwards. If you point it up enough, you want to point it up at a 45-degree angle when you're pulling the trigger, because you want that bar, the back of the hammer, extends from the back of the hammer, to not hang up on that pin right there that the sear spring bears against. So you want to make sure that that hammer pin is laying on top of that. That's how you know that the hammer is back far enough. You can see that. Looks like it's all the way back, so which is nice. We take our the bolt. I'm going to line it up here. Slowly slide it in. And you'll notice sometimes it hangs up right there, at least mine does. It's because back of that recoil spring is kind of a little off center. Center it and it just slides right in, just like that. Okay, so now what we want to do, the last piece we got to get in is this mainspring housing, because it has this this bolt pin over here, the retainer pin, whatever you want to call it. That's what last piece that holds everything together. But we have to move that hammer forward, so it's not, as soon as we put this thing in, it's not going to be in all this, under all the mainspring is not going to be under all that pressure. So we want to point the gun down and pull the trigger, kind of jiggle it a little bit, make sure that hammer falls all the way forward. And then, with the gun still pointed down, because we want that bar from the back of the hammer laying flat, because we don't want it hanging up on this as we're pushing it in. Stick this in the slot like this. Get the pin pointing straight up into the frame of the gun and into the receiver. And you want to kind of give it some upward force. If I could do this and still keep it in the shot. When you're moving this up, you don't want to have anything jamming on this. If you feel any resistance to this twisting like this, you're most likely the hook on the front of that mainspring housing is almost certainly jamming up on that hammer bar, the bar coming out of the back of the hammer. That's not good for the hammer bar. So you want to get this pushed up there. Okay, so we got that, and you can see the whole rounded top of that pin out at the front. The bottom of the pin is now flush with the bottom of this part of the frame, so it's in all the way. Now, what you want to do is you want to turn the gun upside down like this, and you can't really see it, but you want that hammer pin right in there to be laying back against the housing now, because as you rotate it forward, it's going to funnel right into the top of that mainspring until you get in like this, right here, and as you rotate the lever, it's going to pull the bottom of that mainspring housing right in. And at this point, the whole gun is together, and if you did everything correctly, you pull the bolt back, and you should feel the hammer get pulled back. Everything should move pretty smoothly. If you Gave it a little bit of oil, like it should have been oiling it as we were putting it together. Gun is still unloaded, obviously, but every time you pull the trigger, you should check anyway, so it's just a habit. Dry fire it a couple times. Trigger feel, make sure the trigger feels nice and smooth. Make sure the hammer and the slide, everything's, the bolt, make sure everything's nice and smooth. Okay, and at this point, we have completely reassembled our Ruger Mark II, and we're all set to go. Thank you for watching.